what was the fate of women and children born to Germans? We analysed the post-war period in the USSR and European countries. Greetings. Today, you will learn about how women and their children, Germans, born to soldiers of the Third Reich, were treated. We will touch upon not only the post-war period in the Soviet Union, but also in some other European countries. Is it true that female representatives of the female sex had the full right to alimony payments and how much they received? In what European country women who gave birth to the enemy so hated that shaved bald and chased through the city streets practically without clothes? Finally, let's look at where Germans were given to hospitals to test new drugs and medical experiments. Be sure to watch the video to the very end so that you don't miss all the important details, voluntarily or still under duress. Most likely you have a question. Why did girls and women in the occupied territories have relations with German soldiers? And not only in the USSR, but also in other European countries? Did they do it on their own initiative or not? Well, let's understand in order. First, the top leadership of Germany categorically forbade the Nazis to get intimate with the female population. There was a generally accepted Nazi ideology. It was based on the principle of the Aryan race. Adolf Hitler believed that the birth of children from European women, especially women of Slavic appearance, is inadmissible. This contradicted the purity of the German people. Secondly, female representatives at the moment of capture of whole countries and cities were very afraid for their lives. It was especially terrible to die of hunger. The only way to stay alive in such conditions was not to run away. The girls and women fulfilled all the demands and orders from the soldiers and officers of the German army. Except that the Nazi invaders, driven by warm feelings towards the female part, began to engage in intimate intimacy everywhere. The command could not prevent such desires and therefore did not react. But after the liberation of the USSR and European countries, it turned out that some women remained pregnant, and many had already given birth to children by Germans at that time. Such children were called Germans or half-bloods. The fate of such mothers and babies in different countries was decided differently, but about everything in order, humane attitude in the USSR. To begin with, let's analyze the attitude of the Soviet authorities and people to women and Germans, because the number of such a separate category of population, according to unofficial data, was about 100,000 people, although the exact data are unknown until today. We should only trust the West, which made calculations after the end of the war. We draw your attention to the fact that women, mothers and Germans in our country were not recognized as an enemy of the people, nor were they treated as a separate category of Soviet citizens. Therefore, it was forbidden to expel women and Germans from the country, even during the difficult period of repression in the USSR. Yes, at first the people treated with contempt and distrust. Many even expressed not very nice words in public, because of which women often experienced psychological trauma. On top of that, the question of sending the children to orphanages and their mothers to Siberia was repeatedly raised. There are even known such cases, but they are isolated. It is true that such actions stopped and everyone adapted to a normal and full life in the Soviet Union. The state was especially humane and fair. Russian mothers had the full right to alimony. The amount of such allowance was 30 marks monthly. Noble Germans who remained alive often recognized their paternity. Germans who grew up needed education, and as adults, a job. All these conditions were provided by the state of our country. The future generation received everything necessary for normal life in a full-fledged society. As a result, it is safe to say that children born on the territory of the USSR automatically became full-fledged citizens of the country. No questions about nationality were raised. Criticism at that time was inappropriate. As you can probably guess, women with children did not stay only in the USSR. After all, during the war, Germans had mistresses and children in other European countries. For example, in France, Norway, the Netherlands. Let's talk about them. French women dishonored by the people. So, the female part of the population of France was disgraced in the whole country. The French believed that such victims should be properly taught a lesson, and so the state authorities enforced the following decisions. First, 26,000 female representatives of the female sex were collected and shaved bald. After that, they were stripped almost naked and forced to run through the city streets. The unfortunates were so humiliated in public that their psyches soon became disturbed. Some of the women could no longer cope with such a burden. Another part of the female population received a real prison sentence of up to 1 year. And by the way, this is about 18,000 convicted. In France, unlike in the USSR, humanity towards the victims was not shown. The same fate of women in the Netherlands. The Dutch authorities dealt with women in the same way as in France. The latter were collected and then shaved bald. The civilian population of the country did not forgive such betrayal, and therefore some of the inhabitants organized a very real lynching. The victims were dealt with once and for all. According to some reports, the number of those killed was up to 500 girls of different ages. Amazingly, none of these judges were held accountable and punished for what they had done. It was as if the Dutch authorities encouraged such murderers and shared their attitude towards the victimized women. The Germans were given to Norwegian hospitals by appointment. Norway remained on the last list of countries to be tried. After the liberation of the country from the Nazi invaders, the fate of the women and their children was decided once and for all. The authorities decided to dispose of this category of population as follows. The female part was sent to prisons. In accordance with Norwegian law, the term was set to 1 year and 6 months. The number of convicted women who had to give birth from the Germans amounted to approximately 5,000 people. After that, the country's authorities took care of the children, the Germans. Soon, they were given to Norwegian hospitals for their intended purpose. The babies were either used to test new medicines or were given for medical experiments. Specialists were engaged in such activities until the 1960s. But then, a miracle happened. At the beginning of the noughties, the Norwegian authorities recognized such actions as wrong. As compensation, the Norwegian government paid €3,000 for each affected person. So it is fair to say that along with the USSR, Norway also showed humanity and justice. Conclusion. Thus, the fate of women as well as children of German, Russian and other ties during the war years was decided differently. This once again indicates the mentality of this or that country. The USSR acted nobly in view of pity rather than ruthlessness, whereas the European countries acted mostly cruelly, because of which they mocked their victims.